Sweet 16, and they've got their opponent in Duke. We're going to start breaking down the Blue Devils coming up on today's Locked On Texas Tech.
Are Locked On Texas Tech, your daily podcast on the Texas Tech Red Raiders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Texas Tech, a member of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for making Locked On Texas Tech your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you have not subscribed to our channel, please do so now. I'm Ryan Mainville. I cover Texas Tech for the Dallas Morning News. And I'm joined by Emery Lida, a longtime Texas Tech analyst, writer, and podcaster. Today, we're going to continue to dive deep into Duke. I know that we covered them a little bit after the Notre Dame game, but this is a team that is certainly worthy of a full profile. And so we're going to spend the next couple of days digging into this Duke team because there are a lot of stones to turn over. This episode of Locked On Texas Tech is brought to you by StatHero. StatHero is reshaping the way that you play fantasy sports. Dozens of house-based games to play daily. No sharks, no funky props, just your skill versus the lineups you choose. Sign up today at stathero.com/lockedon. Emery, this Duke team is pretty polarizing. They've had quite a season, obviously with Coach K's final year at the helm. Blue Devils finished they're right now in their season. They are 30-6. Obviously went on a couple of really big tears throughout the season. I think their most notable was closing out ACC play where they won 7 games straight, and then obviously in Coach K's final game in Cameron Indoor just got stumped by UNC. But over the course of the season, I know that last game probably skewed your bias a little bit, but what have you seen from this Duke team?
Well, it's one of those teams that when they have been on the season, they have been very difficult to beat. I mean, night one against Kentucky, obviously they had a really good showing inside the arc. And in spite of shooting 1 of 13 from 3, we're still able to really easily win that game. Even if the game looked kind of close, if you look at the fact that they were able to kind of pull a gap throughout the second half and keep Kentucky at arm's length, and that was a really good Kentucky team, and as we would later see. Then they've also had obviously big wins. They had the win over Gonzaga in Vegas early on in the year where they really showed a lot of potential on the defensive end and really kind of provided the blueprint for how to beat Gonzaga, which at the time people thought Gonzaga might have been now on unbeatable. That ended up not being the case, but certainly, I mean, this Duke team has a lot of good wins. Obviously, unfortunately, they also blew out UNC in Chapel Hill by like 20 points, and that was kind of the highlight of their season, among other things. And then they've had really a demolition of the ACC, and some of it I think is the ACC was down this year. Obviously, you now have 3 teams in the Sweet 16, but this Duke team took advantage of the weaker conference. They were able to kind of string together a lot of nice wins, and I mean, offensively, they have looked really good throughout the season. I mean, one of the most efficient offenses in the nation. It's hard to find a weakness for them. Certainly, they shoot the ball well from 3. They're really efficient inside the arc. They have a lot of talented players, which we'll get into in a little bit. Certainly, they have the ability to avoid turning the ball over, which I think is in part due to their style. As I mentioned last night, they really run a lot of isolation and not a ton of player movement when they're in the half court, and then in transition they push the ball. So it's a team that has a lot of talent offensively, but they've been prone to inconsistencies at the same time. They've had their down points in this season. Obviously, the loss to UNC in Cameron Indoor is the most notable one, but they also lost to Virginia Tech in the ACC tournament. They had a really bizarre loss to Miami early in the season, and then they also had just losses to teams like Florida State and to Virginia, neither of which made the tournament. So this is a team that has had their moments this season, certainly on paper, one of the 3 most talented rosters in the NCAA. But despite that, they've had troubles putting it all together at points. I think a lot of it stems from just the inexperience of this team. Not a single player in the rotation outside of Theo John has played an NCAA tournament game. But, I mean, there's a lot that goes into it. This is one of the more polarizing teams out there.
Yeah, they are young, but they are certainly talented, as you mentioned. A lot of what they do comes from their offense. They're currently 9th in KenPom. Texas Tech is 6th. Duke is there because they are 4th in adjusted offensive efficiency and 43rd in defensive efficiency, which is almost like the complete opposite of what Tech is. Tech is obviously 1st in defensive and then 46th in offensive. So kind of inverse there. And I think it shows up whenever you watch this Duke team play. I mean, obviously, the most dangerous thing about this team is their offense. They have had 2 games this season where they have averaged less than 1 point per possession. 2 games. Texas Tech has done that in 4 of their last 6. It is just unreal how good this Duke offense can be when they are clicking. Obviously, you've got so much talent on this roster, and it all works together really well. But, I mean, obviously, nothing short of just the sheer individuals that you've got. I mean, you've got Paulo Banchero, who we mentioned on our pod yesterday. We would have as the number 1 pick in the NBA draft this year by a long shot. Just a guy that does so many things that guys that are 6'10 should not be able to do. Wendell Moore has been shooting the ball extremely well. Trevor Keels comes off the bench and does a lot for them. Mark Williams is massive. AJ Griffin, also a very good shooter. And so this is a Duke team that has a lot of weapons. I mean, they are 3rd in adjusted offensive efficiency per team rank right now, 1st over their last 10 games. They're 10th in effective field goal percentage, 9th in 2-point percentage, 33rd in 3-point percentage. I mean, it's hard when you're looking up and down the numbers that this team has produced to find something that is not almost nerve-wracking.
Yeah, certainly offensively, they have a ton of talent on the roster. I mean, starting out with Paulo Banchero, you're talking about quite possibly one of the most talented isolation players to come through the NCAA in the last few years, certainly as a freshman. And for him to be nearly 6'10" and doing all of that and his fluidity is incredible for someone of that size. And then you look at the rest of the roster. I mean, you've got guys like Wendell Moore who's taken a huge step this year and kind of been their primary ball handler. And even though I don't think he's the most natural ball handler like in the nation, he's certainly got a lot of talent and has developed a lot as a passer in that role. You've got guys like AJ Griffin, who's an elite spot up shooter and really one of the best motion shooters, I think, in the nation this year. And obviously, there's a little bit of question about his health after he kind of left early against Michigan State with an ankle injury, and that might be a question. But I would assume that he's good to play. Then you've got guys like Trevor Keels and Jeremy Roche who've been spark plugs. And then we're remiss not to talk about Mark Williams, who I think is one of the best defensive players, but offensively, he can play as a rim runner. He can play as a post-up player. He's really active on the offensive glass, and he's a good free throw shooter. So there's really not a lot of holes with this team offensively. And I think that's the thing, is just looking at it from a pure talent standpoint, they're as good as they come. Now, I think if you look at it from a stylistic standpoint and kind of fitting together, there might be a little bit of questions. I certainly think that at times it can be a little bit clunky. They take a lot of mid-range shots in the half court, with over 25% of their possessions in the half court end up with a mid-range shot, which for a team with that amount of talent, especially on the outside, is a little bit interesting to me. But certainly this is a team that has a ridiculous amount of talent and have just an array of guys that can beat you on any given night.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, whenever you take the individuals in a vacuum, it's a very dangerous team. And as you mentioned, it hasn't always come together as this perfect puzzle, but in a lot of cases, that hasn't even hurt this team because they are that talented. One weakness I think that this offense might need to work on a little bit, or potentially just find a way to try and use to their advantages, the free throw shooting. They do not get to the line hardly at all, which for a team that's got guys like Banchero, who is so good at taking guys off the dribble, it's a little strange to see this Duke team be in the mid 200s in free throw rate. And so I think that that's kind of one thing that I'm watching in this Texas Tech game I think could be a little bit interesting, is if Texas Tech can play straight up and avoid sending Duke to the free throw line, as has been the case for most of the season for the Blue Devils. I think that obviously helps Texas Tech keep some easy points off the board.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things about this roster, is for all the attacking players that they have, they don't really get to the line a lot. And I think, again, some of it comes in the half court, them settling a lot for mid-range jumpers and even pull-ups. And some of it, I would also argue, kind of comes from just the pace of play that they play with. I mean, you normally would think about a Duke team that plays a lot of up tempo, and certainly they get out in transition quite frequently. That's one of the things that is sort of a staple of Duke under Coach K in recent years. But in the last couple of months, they've been sub 200th in pace of play. And I think that there's positives to that. Certainly, the half court offense has been ridiculously efficient this year. But on the flip side, if you're talking about a team with that much athleticism, that many attacking players like Bankero, you look at Roach, you look at Keels, you look at Moore, all of those guys can get downhill super well. Playing in a real slow half court grind type of offense has been one of those things that, for me, sort of I think limits their ability to get to the line, just because you don't really have the opportunity to play a free flowing, fast paced game, get downhill a lot. And I certainly think that some of it could be just by design. I mean, when you have that much individual talent in the half court, it's hard not to take advantage of those one-on-one matchups, which is a little bit interesting to me how a team that's built like this has not been in transition as frequently as they usually are.
Yeah, definitely something that's been interesting to monitor and something that could come back in this Texas Tech game with obviously how the Red Raiders have tried to limit opponents in transition, although that hasn't always ended exactly well for the Red Raiders. But this is a Texas Tech podcast, so you know we're going to talk about defense. But first, a quick word from StatHero. I love March Madness and bracket contests, but I can't remember the last time I actually went deep and won any money. I'm hedging my bets this year with StatHero. StatHero's NCAA single pick'ems pit the star players against each other in an amazing hybrid between fantasy and sports gambling. Start focusing on the players you know best with a gameplay that doesn't rely on big spreads, long odds, or funky props. StatHero gives you the advantage, resulting in their gamers winning 4 times more often. Why? Because StatHero eliminates the mystery about who or what you are going up against. StatHero is the easiest and fastest way to get your sports action fix. The simple, sleek gameplay will have you playing in minutes. This is what daily fantasy was meant to be. StatHero. Thanks for making Locked On Texas Tech your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms here, talking Duke, Texas Tech. So as we mentioned, kind of the polar opposites that these teams are at in terms of KenPom. Duke, highly favored because of their offense. Texas Tech, highly favored in the metric because of their defense. When you look at Duke's defense, they're a bit of an interesting bunch. They don't do a ton of things extraordinarily well. You look up and down their numbers, and they've been a serviceable defense. I mean, by no means have they been a liability for this Duke team, but certainly has not been a particular strength for them. They're a top 40 in opponent effective field goal percentage. That's pretty solid. But the one thing that really sticks out to me about this Duke team is that they just do not turn you over. They do not turn you over. And it's really, really interesting to monitor because, man, you're coming off playing a defense, if you're Texas Tech, that kind of had the same philosophy, right? This Notre Dame team does not turn over people quite a lot at all. Texas Tech had 8 turnovers in their last game against Notre Dame. And so it's a very different style of defense than what you've seen for 18 games in the Big 12. It's not a team that's super aggressive, that's going to be closing out really hard on the ball, trying to intercept passes, get into the passing lanes, have really aggressive hands. I mean, this is a Duke team that just does not turn you over. And Emery, I'm curious to hear if you think that that's a strength for Texas Tech going into this game, or if it's more so about their opponents than it is about Duke.
Well, one thing that really shocks me is you want to talk about not turning teams over. How about in the last 15 games that they've played, so since February 1st, they are 357th in the NCAA in opponent turnover percentage out of 358 D1 teams. Like, that is ridiculous for a team with the athleticism, the length that Duke has on the perimeter. Like with Notre Dame, you kind of could understand because respectfully, their athletes just aren't quite up to par with like what you would see at a normal Big 12 defense. But certainly the rest of this team, like you would expect them to have the ability to create turnovers, and you just don't see it. And I think some of it's down to defensive philosophy. They certainly are kind of more conservative, just a positional defense. But at the same time, I think it does affect them. It's a strength for Tech because they're not a disruptive defense. And even with guys like Mark Williams, that's a really good interior defender, you've seen cracks in their defensive approach because you have guys getting beat off the dribble, which I guarantee you is not something that Duke wants to see happen. They're not a great transition defense. And even though they don't turn the ball over, when they do get forced into transition, they've allowed teams to shoot really good off of those turnovers and in transition upwards of 35% from three. And this is a team that, like, if they're not forcing turnovers, if they're not forced creating havoc, then that just makes it more difficult on their own defensive goal to stop you in the half court. And then offensively, it kind of keeps them out of transition. But with that said, if it's a strength for Tech or a weakness, I don't know. I think it kind of depends on how this game gets played and what Tech tries to do with the ball. If they're trying to be really assertive and play up tempo, or if they're trying to settle in the half court, because this is a Duke team that's built to kind of play you late into the shot clock. They're not trying to go all for broke, get a turnover, kind of give up the potential easy points. They're going to be playing fundamentally sound defense. And on one hand, that's good if you want to play a real slow, grinded out game and trust your offense to get good looks late in the possession. But on the other hand, kind of takes away some of the boomer bust potential, which I think Tech has been living off of a little bit as of late.
You'd be remiss to talk about this defense and not talk about the ACC Defensive Player of the Year in Mark Williams. Obviously, whenever you're looking at this team and the numbers that they've put up, one area that they do look particularly good in is blocked shots. And obviously, so much has to do with Williams when it comes to that. I think Duke has blocked 204 shots this year, and 104 of them have been from Williams. So obviously, a very, very talented player, 7-foot sophomore. Averaging almost 3 blocks per game this season, just under it at 2.9 right now. So a pretty phenomenal number that he's putting up right now. This is a Duke team that it has played teams down low pretty well. They're familiar with playing in the post and not fouling you. So whenever you've got a guy like Williams, who's going to be matched up probably against a guy also named Williams, what does Texas Tech do? Because here's a little bit of my concern. Texas Tech has favored the post a little bit too much this season. It's showing up on film. There's no other way around it. There have been times where Texas Tech's offense has gotten completely stuck because they've been trying to get the ball inside and get an easy bucket, and it hasn't solidified. I don't feel good about your chances in this one if you're going to be doing that against the ACC Defensive Player of the Year, who is known for blocking shots at an efficient rate and not fouling. I mean, am I being too paranoid here?
No, you're not. I think the solution there is don't try to play post-up basketball against Duke unless they don't have Mark Williams in the game, which you're going to get to have some of those minutes over the course of the game where you can try to use Bryson Williams in the post. And certainly they've shortened the rotation in this game or in the tournament, but it's still something where you're going to see probably 8 to 10 minutes where you don't have Mark Williams. And I'm not as afraid of Theo John, who would be their second rotation big, as I am Williams. I think John isn't quite the athlete that Williams is, doesn't have the length, doesn't really have the instincts. But in general, you want to avoid the post-ups as much as you can because this Duke team is built to defend against them, and they're going to do everything they can to avoid having Williams switch off of the other big, which will more than likely be Bryson Williams. So in essence, you don't want to have to rely on your post-up offense to win you this game, because if you do, it's going to be pretty sketchy because Williams is one of the best shot blockers in the nation. We saw that went with Cisse from Oklahoma State when Tech tried to work out of the post. It was just ugly what the results were. And I think it's weird because there's a lot that Tech can do, I think, to take advantage of this Duke team on the defensive side of things. I think that you look at they switch 1 through 4, and if you run pick and roll against them or any sort of ball screen, they're going to counter that usually by running some sort of drop scheme with either Williams or John on the court. And I think that there's a lot that you can take advantage of there, especially when you're running two bigs like O'Banner and Williams, and you can kind of keep them out of the top of the key. So there's a lot of potential with if Williams comes up, we're talking about Mark Williams, if he comes up on the screen, you can roll the screening to the paint. If he leaves down and drop, you can utilize the pull-up. You can potentially look at a pick and pop action. So there's a lot of potential to utilize there out of the screen game. And it'd be remiss to not look at that as a potential option in this game. And beyond that, I mean, in general, the weakness of this Duke defense, I would argue, is what they have to do with their bigs to keep them in the paint, because neither John or Williams operates particularly well in the perimeter. And teams that have had multiple bigs against them have had success this year. I look at what UNC was able to do in the last regular season game. I look at what Virginia Tech was able to do in the ACC tournament. And to some degree, I look at what Gonzaga was able to do in the half court against them in that game all the way back in the early part of the season. And those are teams that have been able to utilize their two big setup to kind of run, whether it be like horns action or stuff of that nature. And they've been able to have success with screening at the top. And I really think that that's the key to getting by Mark Williams and kind of limiting what he can do defensively, because you're not going to beat him by trying to post him up. Like, as good as Bryson Williams is, I don't think he's faced a post defender quite as good as Mark Williams throughout conference play and throughout the season, outside of maybe Chet Holmgren, but that's a completely different type of defender. And I mean, I'm worried about that, because I think if you try to post them up, it's not going to end well.
Yeah, definitely a very dicey situation for Texas Tech if things don't go well. I want to talk about one more point on the UNC Duke game, but first a quick word from BetOnline. It's that time of year again as college basketball's tournament is finally upon us. From all the latest odds, contests, and player props, BetOnline.net is the #1 source for all your sports betting needs and info. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, Emery, you're clearly not getting sick of talking about this UNC Duke game to spoil Coach K's send-off, so I'm going to keep talking about it and let you kind of celebrate yourself here a little bit. The UNC Duke game was really interesting. I will say that. As I was watching it, it was a very, very interesting game to just like watch as an unbiased bystander. Because what UNC was doing on offense was so unbelievably efficient. Like it was one of the best offensive games I feel like I just caught from a team all season. Now, I'm sure that there are numbers that would refute that, or maybe that's not true, but just in terms of their strategy, it felt like what UNC was doing was executed so perfectly. There were a couple of things that I noticed in that game. Number one, you already hit on the pick and roll game. UNC's guards were electric in that game. I mean, RJ Davis, when he is on, man, that guy is one of the best scorers in the country. It was so fun to watch him play in that Duke game. And then obviously against Baylor the other day, he had a monster game again. But one thing that Duke did is they drew, or UNC did, is they drew the Duke bigs out onto the perimeter, and they forced them to either drop or run with them in coverage. And that did not end well for Duke in their defensive coverage, because guys like Mark Williams, obviously, so much of their production is going to come when they are anchored down low and they can block shots at the rim. Texas Tech has got to find a way to incorporate the pick and roll in this game. And I think Terrence Shannon Jr. could play a little bit of a role in that as well. But we'll talk about him in the rotation in a minute. The other thing that I thought was really interesting is that UNC spaced the floor really, really well. And when you've got a guy like Brady Manick essentially playing in your front court, it's a little bit unfair because the dude shoots like a guard. And it's just a ridiculous offensive player for his size. But again, now you've got two aspects of your offense drawing the Duke bigs out onto the perimeter. They're having to defend the UNC bigs when they're shooting it from three, and they're having to defend the pick and roll. What that did is it allowed lanes for guys like Davis, even Baycott, to score down low with ease. I don't think that I can overestimate the importance of spacing and the pick and roll in this game. I mean, we have seen it time and time again from Texas Tech where they have settled on offensive possessions. They've done that weird weave thing for 15 seconds of the shot clock. In this game, it's going to be about forcing the Duke off defense to stretch. It's going to be about forcing them to come out and make plays on the perimeter. I feel like we haven't talked about spacing a lot this year because it hasn't been as egregious of an issue as I thought it would be. But in this game, it truly might be the most important factor in giving Texas Tech a chance at a victory.
Yeah, it gives me flashbacks when I think about what I want to do, what I would do if I was Mark Adams in this game. It gives me flashbacks to when I was like 13 or 14 playing 2K, and I would just spam pick and roll the entire game, regardless of the time, regardless of score, regardless of who I had on the court. And I genuinely think that running a lot of pick and roll action is going to be critical in this one. And I mean, you touched on it. The two biggest things that UNC did was they forced the big into a difficult decision, whether it be dropping playing the drop and allowing a guy like RJ Davis to come off of the screen and get an open pull up, or have a good lane to pass to, or bringing the bigs up, which in that case, Mark Williams and Theo John both got absolutely torched whenever they tried to come up on screens. And that would in turn allow for free rolls for Baycott or pick and pop opportunities for Manic. And that was basically the whole game. And certainly the spacing as well was something that was really critical. UNC, when they didn't have Baycott out on the court, had 5 guys that could shoot pretty much at all times. And they did a good job of utilizing the cuts. And specifically in the first half, we saw more of the 5 out. In the second half, you had Baycott out for all 20 minutes, which I know we're going to talk about. But certainly you had really an offense that was structurally designed to put Duke's bigs in really rough situations. And I think that Tech has the personnel to do most of what UNC did in that game. I feel like you have the 2 shooting bigs in Williams and O'Banner. You have Williams, who's, I think, a really good interior presence and can certainly operate out of the short roll, similar to what Baycott was able to do. Obviously, you have both of them able to shoot from the top of the key. You've got floor spacers and guys that can at least be average 3-point shooters on their day. And you've got guards like a TJ Shannon that can be explosive. I guess the one question that I have, and it's probably down to just looking at the guards and whether or not they're having a good day, is can you have a guard with the RJ Davis-like performance? And I know obviously it's not going to be exact. They're different styles of player. I don't think Tech has anyone that can be exactly what RJ Davis was in that game. But if you can have a guard that's able to effectively hit the pull-up and can get to the rim and out-drive some of Duke's wings or even their bigs when they come up in coverage, that's going to be absolutely critical. And I guess that's the thing. I don't have any questions about Tech being able to schematically execute this from the big standpoint and from being able to get the screen and sort of put Duke's bigs in the bind. I just have a little bit of questions as to whether or not Tech can hit those shots and really force them to pay for that.
I think there are 3 candidates that could do that for this Texas Tech team. One of them is Kevin McCullough, which I feel like is the least likely of the 3. The second is Davion Warren, and the first is obviously TJ Shannon. And so I think giving him the space to kind of do that in this game is going to be really big. And I'm kind of confused on what's going on with him in the rotation right now.
Yeah, I don't think we've seen him as a ball handler as much as we should at times. And that's something, like, he's getting pulled very quickly. That's one of the things that I know was really confusing in the Notre Dame game. But beyond that, just like even his role offensively, it seems like he goes games at a time where he just doesn't have that on-ball role.
Yeah, and it's strange because I think we saw a little bit of it in the Iowa State Conference Tournament game. Obviously, that game with just how skewed the scoring was for Texas Tech, it's kind of hard to analyze things clearly. But he did get the ball to the rim pretty well there. And then obviously the shooting was so good for him in the 2 games at tournament and then to open up against Montana State. And then he would just like play a possession and then get pulled against Notre Dame. And I guess I'm just a little curious about what's going on with the rotation right now. But essentially my overarching, it's not necessarily a concern, mainly just a question is, what does this Texas Tech team do with the rotation in this game? Because Duke is running essentially 6 guys. They're running their starting 5, and then they're running Keels off the bench. They're giving Theo John some spot minutes, and then a couple of other guys off the bench when absolutely necessary. But it's really 6.5 guys, considering Theo John. And Texas Tech played 10 guys against Notre Dame the other day. And I posted about this in Red Raider Sports because I wanted to know what the good people over there thought about it. And I think a lot of people had a good point in that this is what's worked for Texas Tech all season. This Texas Tech team obviously has unbelievable depth. It's been an asset for them all season. Why would you move away from it now? But I guess my mindset is that I'm in the conventional bend is that I want my 5 best players on the court as much as possible. Especially against a team that's as dangerous as Duke. And so looking at this team, I think I'm more comfortable having guys like Kevin McCullough play 35 minutes, guys like TJ trying to stay out there for 28, Bryson Williams 30+, depending on foul trouble, even guys like Arms and Warren who can be inconsistent at times, giving them 28 minutes to try and do something. I mean, it's just a really, really interesting scenario here. You've got Duke, who, I mean, their first 5 might be the best first 5 in the country. Maybe Gonzaga has the upper hand there, but just an extraordinary team. And it doesn't really matter that they're not bringing anybody off the bench because their first five is so good. And then you've got Texas Tech that you've got 7 or 8 guys that could be your leading scorer on any given night. It just feels like a very, very strange scenario. And there are more questions than answers at this point. And that'll probably be the case until these two teams play.
Here's the thing I'll say to that. I think that the flip side of that argument is you could make a case that you have individual traits from at least 8 different players on this roster that could be really valuable against Duke. I mean, obviously, you have the starting 5 of McCullough, Shannon, Arms, Williams, and O'Banner. You have Davion Warren off the bench. Those guys are going to play. That's non-negotiable. You have a guy like Clarence who is really, really good at communicating defensively. And I think this is going to be one of those games where if you're looking to really force the tempo, which we've established that Duke's half-court defense is certainly better than its transition defense. So getting him out into transition is ironically something that you kind of want to do. Having a guy like Clarence out there could potentially be valuable. You have Malik Wilson, who might be the shiftiest guard that you have. That's also a really good defender as well. Probably your most versatile defender. I think it's going to be really important to see him trying to play against a guy like AJ Griffin potentially. You have Daniel Bacho, who is probably the only guy who can match up lengthwise to Mark Williams. So you're going to give him spot minutes more than likely, at least to try that. And then outside of that, you can't just completely benchmark Santos Silva. I mean, he's probably your best team defender, switches the best out of any of your bigs. So at that point, you're talking about running 10 deep right there, and you have viable reasons to play all of them. All of them have potential benefits that they can give you to this Duke matchup. And I feel like that's kind of a key difference between these two teams, and really, as well as that, the difference between some of the teams that run short is a team like Duke that has the starting 6, obviously, of 6 NBA caliber players, and then has Theo John, who's kind of a serviceable big. You look behind them on the roster, nobody provides anything that the rest of the roster can't provide. Like if you look at their top 3 shooters, sure, you have Joey Baker out there who can be a serviceable shooter, but why do you need that when you already have Keels, Griffin, and Moore who can all be really good shooters as well that can provide so much more? You have depth pieces that really aren't even necessary. So, I mean, for Tech, I think it's a different equation. I do think that you're going to see the rotation short, and I think you're going to see your main guys, the McCullers, the Williams, and hopefully TJ, play 30-plus minutes just because of the magnitude of the game, and you want your most serviceable players playing more. But I think every single one of the guys that's in this rotation, maybe even Buzo, have earned at least a little bit of an opportunity just because of the potential value they can bring to the table against this Duke team. And I think that's the biggest difference is Tech has 10 guys, maybe 11 in their rotation that can give you something that someone on the rest of the roster can't match quite as well, or they have a role that is clearly defined towards them. And I just don't think that's the case with Duke. And I think that's why you see the rotation run so thin.
Yeah, and it's interesting because obviously with those 10 guys, potential benefits always come with potential costs. And so you've got to be, I think, really smart in this game about how you're subbing and how you're kind of running out lineups. Like, man, I cannot do a Clarence Nadolny, Daniel Bacho, KJ Adams lineup in this game. Like, I think I'd have a stroke. It can't happen. And so I think you've got to be really smart with the 5 that you run out there. But I do think that depth is going to be really intriguing in this game for 2 reasons. If you can just blast them in transition and you try and play as fast as you can and you try and gas them, I think that your athleticism and your depth play into your favor there. And then also just try and get them into foul trouble. It's something that this Duke team has been really good at avoiding so far this year. But just try. Like, honestly, it was unbelievable. Emery, I'm about to roast your Tar Heels a little bit, and I hope that you don't take it personally. But in that Baylor-UNC game, UNC was in insane amount of foul trouble. Obviously, they lost Brady Manick due to a really bad ejection, but UNC had a couple of guys come off the bench, and they couldn't even get the ball in bounds. Like, it looked like they were – like, I played guys in middle school that were better than some of the guys that were coming off the bench. It was unbelievable. Unbelievable, man. And, like, that's a testament to what you're saying is that, like, these guys on Duke's bench, they haven't played. Like, they have not played because Duke's first 6 is so good that they're not getting minutes. And so I think if you can find a way to get man, even just one or two of these guys into foul trouble, that's where your bench becomes a tremendous asset in this game.
I'll even take it a step further. If you get Mark Williams into foul trouble, the drop off between him and Theo John is enough to swing this game. And that's literally, I mean, I do not for a second want Tech to adopt the strategy of pound the ball into the paint and just see what happens, because I don't think it's going to end well. But if there's one time to try it, it's for the sole purpose of getting Mark Williams into foul trouble. And as good as he's been at avoiding fouls, if you have the right set of refs and the right set of circumstances, you can make it happen. And I mean, having Theo John in the court as opposed to Mark Williams would change the game. And I agree that getting them into foul trouble, I mean, I'd argue that Duke's drop off between the seventh guy and the eighth guy is as big, if not bigger, as what UNC had. And I mean, we all saw that game. Unfortunately, we saw what happened in the second half. And thankfully, RJ Davis had the game of his life, and Baycott had a really good ending to the game, or else we might be talking about this in a much more somber tone. But I mean, you look at what Duke has beyond their seventh guy. It's literally Joey Baker's the only other guy on their roster that I feel like has any sort of serviceable merit as to being a guy that can get minutes. Outside of that, you're literally talking about having to really manage the foul trouble. So that's the one thing Tech has an advantage over with their depth, but certainly Duke's top six guys are going to be really difficult to beat just because of the pure talent that they have on their roster. And there's a reason they play such a short rotation, and it's because you've got some of the most talented players in the country. You've got a roster that seems to be tailor-made to be able to play both in the half court and in transition. And I mean, offensively, this can be a fascinating team to have to defend.
A really interesting Duke team, and we've already gone over our final buzzer here. But luckily, we have all week to continue to break down this team, and we are going to do just that. So be sure that you are subscribed and following the Locked On podcast feed wherever you get podcasts. We will have our Duke coverage right here on Locked On Texas Tech. You can also follow us on Twitter. You can follow me at rmainvillelbk. You can follow Emery at eraser41. Emery's doing a ton of good film studies right now. If you haven't watched this Duke team play very much this season, I highly suggest that you go check those out. Very informative. And then you can also follow the official Locked On Texas Tech Twitter page at Locked On TTU so you never miss an episode. Until then, thanks for making Locked On Texas Tech your first listen every day. Now make your second listen Locked On NFL Draft. Ryan Tracy and former NFL cornerback Eric Crocker bring the NFL Draft to life every day with insight and analysis on college football prospects and NFL front offices. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you tomorrow.